In the late 1990s, there was a subculture that took over the teenage world, and it was known as the goth movement. Now, simply put, a goth is someone who finds beauty in things that most other people consider to be pretty dark or even macabre. But to most Americans who lived through that era, the term goth was immediately associated with teenagers who wore all black, painted their fingernails black, wore heavy black combat boots, and spent their weekends hanging out in local cemeteries. And while that representation of goth culture is of course very limited, it actually was a perfect description of two best friends named Rachel and Molly. Rachel and Molly lived in a small, sleepy town where there really was not a whole lot for teenagers to do. They were full-blown goths. They had dyed black hair, heavy black makeup, and they always wore dark, oversized clothes with heavy combat boots that clattered against the pavement. At one point, they and their small circle of friends started hanging out in the local cemetery on Friday nights. Initially, they did it just to be ironic and funny. They thought it was hilarious to lean against old tombstones and joke about how goth they were. But over time, they actually started to enjoy the quietness of the place, and before long, hanging out in the cemetery became their regular weekend routine. But despite their tough exterior, Rachel and Molly were smart girls, and they recognized that a dark cemetery at night could be a dangerous place. Because of this, they had one strict rule: they never went to the cemetery alone. They always traveled in a group of at least 4 or 5 people. Having that safety in numbers made them feel secure, allowing them to relax and enjoy their night. But on one particular Friday night in the middle of summer, everything changed. Rachel was sitting in her bedroom, bored out of her mind. She had no plans, and she was just staring at her ceiling, wishing something would happen. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was Molly. Molly asked her if she wanted to go hang out at the cemetery. Since Rachel was so desperate to get out of the house, she immediately agreed. She ran downstairs, sat on the front steps of her house, and waited for Molly to arrive. After a few minutes, Molly's car came rolling down the quiet street. But as the vehicle got closer, Rachel noticed something unusual. The headlights were bright, but the interior of the car was completely dark, and it appeared that Molly was the only one inside. Rachel walked down the driveway, opened the passenger door, and hopped in. She looked into the back seat, expecting to see their friends, but it was completely empty. Rachel turned to Molly and asked where everyone else was, wondering if they were just meeting them at the gates. Molly shook her head and explained that unfortunately, everyone else was busy. Some of them were working late shifts, and others were still hungover from a party they had attended the night before. So, for this evening, it was just going to be the two of them. Now when Rachel heard this, a small warning bell went off in her head. She did not feel comfortable going to the cemetery with just one other person. It broke their main safety rule. But she didn't want to seem like a coward, and she didn't want to ruin Molly's night. So she kept her worries to herself, smiled, and said that was totally fine. She told Molly that they would just go hang out for a little bit and make it a quick trip. Molly put the car in drive, and they began the familiar winding commute toward the center of town. The cemetery they were heading to was an absolutely massive, historic property that sat right in the middle of their city. As they approached, Molly drove the car underneath a giant, medieval-looking wrought iron gate. It looked like something straight out of a classic horror movie, very imposing and dark. A single asphalt road ran directly through the center of the cemetery, splitting the property into 2 distinct halves. On the left side of the road, the cemetery bordered a major public university, and it also sat right up against the edge of the busy town. But on the right side of the road, the land was much more isolated, bordering a dense line of trees and some distant residential neighborhoods. Where Rachel and Molly liked to hang out was all the way in the back right corner of the cemetery. To get there, Molly had to turn off the main drive and head down a narrow, dead-end dirt road for about 200 yards. This specific section of the cemetery was situated in a small valley between 2 rolling hills. Because of this depression in the land, anyone standing down there was completely invisible from the main road and the surrounding neighborhoods. It was the ultimate private spot, featuring a massive boulder they liked to sit on and a giant oak tree they could lean against. Molly parked the car at the dead end, and the 2 girls stepped out into the humid night. They walked down the slope of the hill into the dark clearing, lit up cigarettes, and began to talk. Rachel climbed onto the top of the boulder, facing back up toward the road where their car was parked, while Molly leaned against the oak tree right next to her. For the next hour, they just did what teenagers do. They smoked, talked about their relationships, complained about school, and caught up on all the town gossip. But after about an hour of this, the air began to change. Rachel suddenly noticed a very distinct smell. It was the smell of wood smoke, like a bonfire. Because they were down in this little valley, they couldn't see very far in any direction, so there were no visible flames. But they knew that college kids from the nearby university would sometimes sneak into the cemetery and build bonfires on the opposite side of the property. The problem was, whenever college kids built a bonfire, neighbors would notice the smoke and call the police. And when the police arrived, they wouldn't just go to the fire. They would drive their patrol cars through every single road in the cemetery to make sure there was nobody else hiding out. Rachel and Molly knew that if the police found them there, they would get in big trouble for trespassing. Rachel suggested that they should probably pack up and head home before the police showed up. Molly agreed, and Rachel hopped down from the boulder. They started walking back up the hill toward where Molly's car was parked. But when they got about halfway up the slope, they both stopped. Because they had gained some elevation, they could now see over the hill to their right, and down in the next clearing, they could see the bright, flickering orange light of a bonfire. Now, even from this height, they couldn't see the base of the fire or any people, as the fire was too deep in the depression on the other side. But they knew for a fact that when they had driven in an hour ago, there was no fire over there. This meant that whoever built this fire had arrived while Rachel and Molly were already sitting at their boulder. And because Rachel and Molly's car was parked slightly off the main path, and they had been totally silent down in their valley, it was highly likely that these newcomers had no idea the girls were there. Molly looked at Rachel, her eyes lighting up with excitement. She whispered that they should sneak over the hill and spy on them, figuring it was just a bunch of college kids having a party. But Rachel felt a sudden knot in her stomach. She started thinking about the logistics. If this was a college party, why would they choose the absolute furthest, most isolated corner of the cemetery to build a fire? The university was on the complete opposite side. If you were a college student, you would have to hike a massive distance in the dark just to get to this spot. It didn't make any sense. It felt too deliberate, too hidden, but Molly was already moving, and Rachel didn't want to be left behind in the dark. So, despite her hesitation, she followed Molly back down the hill, past their boulder, and they started walking up the side of the second hill toward the flickering light. They had only taken a few steps up this new hill when the air suddenly hit them. It wasn't the smell of wood smoke anymore. It was this horrific, putrid, chemical, and organic smell that was so incredibly foul it literally made Rachel gag. It smelled like burning plastic combined with something rotten and metallic. Rachel instantly covered her mouth and nose, and without thinking, she gasped out loud, asking what that horrible smell was. As soon as the words left her mouth, she realized she had spoken in her normal volume. In the dead silence of the night, her voice had echoed right over the hill. Molly froze. Rachel froze. They stood there in absolute silence, waiting to see if whoever was on the other side of the hill had heard them. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Molly whispered if they should keep going, but Rachel's entire body was screaming at her to run. The smell was so deeply unnatural, and she knew she had just given away their position. She looked at Molly and whispered that they needed to leave right now. Molly looked disappointed, but she could see the genuine terror in Rachel's face, so she nodded. They turned around and started walking back down the hill. They passed the boulder on their left, and they were just about to head up the slope toward their car when Rachel felt a sudden urge to look back. She stopped and turned her head toward the crest of the hill where the bonfire was. And there, standing at the very top of the hill, backlit by the bright orange flames of the bonfire, was the silhouette of a man. He was just standing there, completely still, staring directly down at them. Because the fire was behind him, they couldn't see his face, but they could clearly see he was a grown man, and he was watching them intensely. Rachel and Molly felt a wave of cold dread wash over them. It felt like they had just been caught doing something terrible. They turned their heads back down, quickened their pace, and started walking up the hill toward their car. After a few steps, Rachel couldn't help herself, and she looked back again. The man was no longer standing at the top of the hill. At first, Rachel felt a tiny wave of relief, thinking he had gone back to his fire. But then she looked lower down the slope. The man was not gone. He was power walking down the hill directly toward them, and he was moving incredibly fast. Rachel gasped, grabbed Molly by the shoulder, and pushed her forward. She screamed at her to run. The two girls began sprinting up the steep hill toward the car. Rachel looked over her shoulder one more time, and now the man was in a full-blown sprint. He had reached their boulder, and he was closing the distance between them at an alarming rate. They crested the hill, ran to the passenger and driver sides of Molly's car, and Molly was frantically fumbling with her keys in the dark. Rachel was screaming at her to hurry up, staring into the darkness behind them, waiting for the man's head to pop up over the ridge. Finally, the lock clicked. They threw the doors open, jumped inside, and Rachel instantly locked all the doors. Molly jammed the key into the ignition, turned it, and the engine roared to life. As Molly put the car in reverse and started backing up, Rachel looked out the back window. And right there, emerging from the darkness at the top of the ridge, was the man. He stood there just long enough to watch them pull away, his eyes locked on their car, before he slowly turned around and disappeared back into the darkness. Molly slammed the car into drive, sped down the dirt road, threw the car onto the main drive, and they flew out of the cemetery gates. For the first 10 minutes of the drive, neither of them said a word. They were both in a state of absolute shock. When they finally started talking, they tried to rationalize what had happened. They thought maybe it was just a weird guy who got mad that they were near his fire. But that smell. They couldn't explain that horrific, sickening smell. And the man didn't look like a college student. He looked like he was in his late 40s, and there was something deeply sinister about the way he had chased them. Eventually, they decided to just go home and sleep on it. Molly dropped Rachel off, and Rachel went straight to her room and fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, Rachel walked down to the kitchen. Her mother was sitting at the table drinking her morning coffee. Rachel sat down, not planning on saying anything about her night. She didn't want to get grounded for being in the cemetery after hours. Her mother was just rambling about her work schedule, but suddenly she stopped. She looked at Rachel and asked her if she had heard the news. Rachel said she hadn't. Her mother explained that a woman who worked in the very same building as her had been kidnapped from the parking garage the night before. Rachel's heart began to beat a little faster. She asked what happened to her. Her mother sighed and said that they had found her, but it was too late. The kidnapper had killed her, and then, in an attempt to destroy the evidence, he had taken her body to the local cemetery and tried to burn her in a massive bonfire. Rachel felt the color completely drain from her face. She felt physically sick. In that exact moment, she realized what that horrific, putrid smell was. It was the smell of a human body being burned. And she realized that the man who had chased them was not some angry college student. He was an active killer, and they had interrupted him in the middle of disposing of his victim. Rachel burst into tears and told her mother everything. Her mother was absolutely horrified. She realized that her daughter had been standing just 50 yards away from a murderer while he was actively burning a body. She told Rachel that she and Molly had to go to the police station immediately. Rachel called Molly, told her the horrific truth, and the two girls went to the police. They gave the detectives everything they could remember, but because it had been so dark and the man was backlit, they could only provide a vague description. He was a white male, likely in his 40s, of average height and build. The police thanked them but admitted it wasn't much to go on. For the next 48 hours, Rachel and Molly lived in absolute terror. They kept wondering if the killer had seen their license plate, if he knew who they were, or if he was going to come after them. But luckily, 2 days later, the police spotted the victim's missing car. They pulled the driver over, and it was the man from the cemetery. He was arrested, and during his interrogation, he broke down and confessed to the entire thing. He was sent to prison for life. Rachel and Molly never went back to that cemetery again. And every time Rachel thought about that night, she thanked her lucky stars that she had convinced Molly to turn around and walk away from that hill. Because if they had taken just a few more steps over that ridge, they would have walked right into a monster and they might have ended up in that fire themselves. Now, let's go back in time, all the way to the summer of 1904. A young woman named Anna Gray was staying in a second-story room at a small, cozy bed and breakfast in the bustling city of Chicago, Illinois. It was the middle of the night, and Anna was lying in her bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. She was incredibly frustrated because she simply could not fall asleep. Part of the reason was that her stomach was in knots. Earlier that evening, she had eaten a minced meat pie, and it was not agreeing with her. Her stomach was rumbling and aching, making it impossible to get comfortable. On top of that, the air in the room was completely still and stuffy. It was a hot summer night, and there was absolutely no breeze coming through the room. Eventually, Anna decided she couldn't take it anymore. She threw her blankets off, stood up, and walked over to the large window. She unlocked it and pushed it open, letting the cool night air wash over her face. Standing by the open window, feeling the gentle breeze, her stomach started to settle just a little bit. And now that she was getting some fresh air, she suddenly felt this wave of exhaustion wash over her. She smiled to herself, thinking that opening the window was exactly what she needed. She walked back to her bed, climbed under the covers, and within a few minutes, she had drifted off into a deep sleep. But several hours later, in the dead of night, Anna suddenly snapped awake. Her eyes shot open and she lay there, completely paralyzed. At first, she was disoriented as she couldn't remember where she was. But then she remembered she was in the bed and breakfast in Chicago, and she was scheduled to go home the very next day. But as she lay there, trying to calm her racing heart, she felt this overwhelming sensation that she was not alone. It was that instinctual feeling of dread that everyone gets when they feel like they are being watched. Slowly, Anna sat up in her bed and began to scan the dark room. Everything looked completely normal at first. The dresser was in its place, the chair was empty, and the door was shut. But then her eyes drifted over to the open window. And her breath caught in her throat. Sitting directly on the windowsill, crouched down and looking right into her room, was a man. He was staring directly at her. His eyes were wide and he didn't blink. He just sat there perched on the second-story windowsill. Watching her, Anna was absolutely terrified. She started thinking about how this man must have climbed up the side of the building just to get to her room. She didn't know if she was having a nightmare or if this was real life. But instead of freezing or screaming like most people would, Anna's survival instincts kicked in, and they told her to fight. She leapt out of her bed and lunged toward the window, determined to push this intruder out. But as soon as she made her sudden movement, the man didn't flinch. Instead, he did something incredibly bizarre. He slowly and delicately leaned backward, gravity took over, and he fell backward off the second-story ledge into the darkness below. Anna ran to the window and looked down, expecting to see a mangled body on the pavement. But when she looked down, the ground was completely empty. There was nobody there. She looked around, confused, wondering how someone could survive a fall from that height and just vanish. And then, her eyes noticed something parked under a flickering streetlight across the road. It was a long, dark vehicle. She couldn't remember if that vehicle had been there when she opened the window earlier. It looked deeply out of place. As she stared at the vehicle, she saw movement in the driver's seat. The driver bent down low, looking up through the windshield directly at Anna's second-story window. And as the light hit his face, Anna realized with absolute horror that the driver of this vehicle was the exact same man who had just been sitting on her windowsill. But what made this situation even more terrifying was the vehicle itself. Anna realized she was looking at a hearse. The man in the hearse slowly extended his arm out of the driver's side window. He raised his hand and began to beckon to Anna, waving his hand in a slow, chilling motion, signaling for her to come down and get into the back of the hearse with him. Anna was so overcome with terror, she slammed the window shut, locked it, drew the curtains, and backed away into the center of the room. She stood there shivering, wondering if she was losing her mind. After a few minutes, she knew she had to look again. She had to know if he was still out there. She crept back to the window, parted the curtains slightly, and looked out. The street was empty. The hearse and the man were gone. Anna didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She just sat on her bed, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally came and the room was filled with bright, warm sunlight, Anna felt a sense of relief. She started to rationalize the entire experience. She told herself that it had to have been a dream. She had eaten that heavy minced pie, her stomach was upset, and she was in an unfamiliar bed. It was just a highly vivid, terrifying nightmare. Convinced that she was perfectly safe and that nothing strange had actually happened, Anna packed her bags, checked out of the bed and breakfast, and headed into the city. She had some time to kill before her train home, so she decided to visit a brand new, massive department store that had just opened in downtown Chicago. The store was incredible. It was 4 stories tall, packed with beautiful displays, and bustling with hundreds of excited shoppers. For the next few hours, Anna completely forgot about her terrifying night. She walked from floor to floor, picking out items, enjoying the lively atmosphere, and having a wonderful time. By the time she reached the 4th floor, she had completed all of her shopping and decided it was time to make her way to the train station. She walked over to the elevator bank to ride down to the 1st floor. She pressed the button and waited. After a few minutes, she heard a loud chime and the heavy metal doors slid open. The elevator car was absolutely packed with people. There was barely any room left inside. Anna looked at the crowd, waved her hand dismissively, and told them to go ahead without her. She said she would just wait for the next car. This was a completely normal, everyday interaction. She expected the doors to close and the elevator to descend, but the doors stayed open. Suddenly, a loud, harsh, and demanding voice boomed out from the back of the elevator car. The voice called out to Anna, telling her that there was room for one more and ordering her to get in. Anna was taken aback by the aggressive tone of the voice. She looked into the packed elevator to see who had spoken, and then she saw the operator of the elevator. In those days, elevators were operated manually by a staff member who controlled the lever. The operator poked his head out from behind the crowd of passengers to look directly at Anna. And Anna's heart stopped. The elevator operator was the exact same man who had been sitting on her windowsill the night before. The exact same man who had beckoned her to get into his hearse. Anna gasped in pure horror. She backed away from the elevator, shaking her head, and cried out that she was not getting in. The passengers in the elevator looked at her like she was crazy. The operator stared at her for a cold second, sneered, and then pulled the lever. The heavy doors slid shut, and the elevator began its descent. Anna stood by the elevator bank, trying to breathe, telling herself that she was letting her imagination get the best of her. It was just a coincidence. The operator just looked similar to the man in her nightmare, but as she was trying to calm herself down, a horrific sound echoed up from the elevator shaft. It was a loud, violent, metallic crunching sound, followed immediately by the blood-curdling screams of the passengers inside. The elevator car had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. It had plummeted 4 stories straight down to the basement, crashing with incredible force. 2 of the passengers on board were killed instantly, and several others were permanently injured. Anna stood there, frozen in shock, realizing that if she had gotten onto that elevator, she would have been inside when it fell. She had survived because she refused to get in with the man who had invited her into his hearse. Anna later spoke to reporters about her incredible and chilling experience, and her story was published in newspapers across the country, leaving people to wonder if she had experienced a genuine premonition of death itself. Now we move to the spring of 2005, to a small, remote village in the country of Uganda. A 64-year-old man named John Manine was crouched low in a thick patch of bushes near the edge of a large, dark lake. Around him, several of his neighbors and fellow villagers were also crouched in the dirt, keeping completely silent. They were all holding their breath, scanning the pitch-black water and the surrounding shoreline for any signs of movement. They were absolutely exhausted, having spent the last several nights doing the exact same thing. But more than exhausted, they were absolutely terrified. You see, John Manine had lived in this village his entire life. He was a highly respected elder with 9 children and 31 grandchildren. He remembered a time when the village was a beautiful, peaceful place where children could run around and play, and families didn't have to lock their doors at night, but all of that had changed 14 years earlier in 1991. Starting in that year, a shadow fell over the village. People began to die in the most horrific and mysterious ways. It would start with someone going down to the lake to wash their clothes or fetch water, and they would just vanish. Sometimes they were never seen again. But other times, their bodies would wash ashore days later, horribly mutilated and torn to pieces. Over the course of 14 years, 83 people from this tiny village had been killed in this exact manner. To put that into perspective, 83 people represented 10% of the village's entire population. Practically everyone in the village had lost a close friend, a sibling, a parent, or a child to this mysterious threat, because the attacks were so sudden, and because nobody had ever actually seen what was doing this and lived to tell the tale. The villagers became convinced that they were being targeted by a demon. They believed that a malevolent supernatural force had cursed their village and that there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. They simply accepted that dying a horrific death by the lake was a tragic part of living in their village, but John Manine refused to accept this. He didn't believe in demons, and he knew that there had to be a logical, physical explanation for what was happening. And in early 2005, the situation reached a breaking point. A young boy, a beloved child from the village, went down to the lake in the morning and never came back. John looked at his own grandchildren and realized that any one of them could be next. He decided that enough was enough. He went to the village square and rounded up a group of brave men. He told them that they were going to hunt this thing down, whether it was a man, an animal, or a demon. His passion and determination were contagious. The villagers, who had lived in fear for over a decade, suddenly felt a spark of hope. They agreed to join John on a massive stakeout. They decided to set up their trap in an area of the shoreline they called the butchery. They called it this because the vast majority of the 83 victims had either disappeared from this specific spot or their mutilated remains had been found there. So, on the very first night of the stakeout, John and his volunteers made their way to the butchery. They climbed into the thick, tall reeds and bushes right at the water's edge and crouched down. They kept their eyes glued to the dark, still surface of the lake. The water was pitch black, reflecting the cold light of the moon. For hours, they sat in the freezing dampness, jumping at every tiny sound, expecting some horrifying creature to leap out of the dark and drag them under. But when the sun rose the next morning, nothing had happened. John refused to give up. He told them they had to go back. The second night, they went back out. Again, nothing. The third, fourth, fifth, and 6 nights passed in the exact same way. By the end of the 6th night, the volunteers were incredibly demoralized and physically spent. They were losing sleep, their bodies were aching, and they started to believe that the demon was mocking them. Many of them wanted to call off the hunt and go back to their lives. But John begged them for just one more night. He promised them that if they stayed out for a 7th night and still saw nothing, he would let it go. The men reluctantly agreed. But for this final night, John decided to change their strategy. He realized that whatever was killing their people was likely a predator looking for food. So, during the day, they went to a local butcher and gathered a large amount of raw organ meat. They took this meat down to the butchery and hung it from the low-hanging branches of the trees right along the shoreline, hiding large metal hooks inside the meat. That night, the men took their positions in the bushes once again. Hours crawled by. The village was completely silent. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the volunteers were starting to drift off to sleep, convinced that this night would be another waste of time. But then, around 4:30, a strange sound broke the silence. It was a low, deep, rumbling growl. It was so deep that John could actually feel the vibration in the ground beneath his feet. The sound seemed to be coming from the lake. John whispered to the men to stay down and keep completely still. They all stared out at the black water. Suddenly, they saw ripples forming on the glassy surface. Something massive was moving through the water, heading directly toward the shore. The rumbling sound grew louder and louder, vibrating through their chests, and then the water erupted. A massive, dark, prehistoric shape emerged from the lake. It was so incredibly large that the men in the bushes gasped in sheer terror. The creature charged onto the land, its massive body sliding through the mud. But it didn't head toward the bushes where the men were hiding. Instead, attracted by the smell of the raw meat, it lunged up and bit down on the hanging organs. The moment its jaws snapped shut, the metal hooks sank deep into its mouth, securing it to the heavy tree trunk. The creature began to thrash violently, let out a terrifying roar, and beat its massive tail against the ground, shaking the trees. John Manine realized that their trap had worked. He jumped up from the bushes and sprinted back to the village, screaming at the top of his lungs for everyone to wake up and come help. Within minutes, over 50 villagers came running down to the shoreline armed with ropes, spears, and torches. When they reached the butchery, they stood in absolute shock at what they were looking at. It was not a demon. It was a saltwater crocodile. But not just any crocodile. This was a monster. It was 16 feet long and weighed over 2,000 pounds. It was estimated to be over 60 years old. For 14 years, this giant beast had been silently terrorizing their village, dragging people into the depths of the lake without leaving a single trace. The villagers wanted to kill the monster right then and there to avenge their lost loved ones. But wildlife officials were quickly notified and rushed to the scene. They prevented the villagers from killing the animal, explaining that it was a protected species. Instead, they managed to safely bind the crocodile and transport it to a national park, far away from any human settlements. With the monster finally gone, the dark cloud over the village lifted, and for the first time in 14 years, the people of the village could sleep in peace, knowing that the demon of the lake was finally gone. Let's travel to another incredibly harsh and unforgiving environment. This time, we are going to the freezing Arctic region of northern Canada in the spring of 1848. A group of Inuit hunters were making their way across the frozen landscape of King William Island. The air was incredibly cold, well below zero, and the wind was howling across the barren ice. The hunters were heading toward the coastline, hoping to find some seals resting on the ice sheets so they could hunt them for food and hide. As they walked, they approached a large, steep hill made of solid ice and snow that blocked their view of the open ocean. The youngest hunter in the group, full of energy, ran ahead of the others and climbed up the steep slope of the hill to get a look over the other side. But the moment he reached the crest of the hill and looked down at the coastline, he stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw dropped and he stared down in complete disbelief. He couldn't comprehend what he was looking at. It didn't make any sense. He quickly backed down the hill, out of sight of the coast, and frantically signaled for the other hunters to join him. The older hunters, sensing the extreme urgency in his movements, rushed up the hill. Together, they peered over the crest of the ice hill, and they were struck with a deep sense of horror. Down on the frozen coastline, walking in a slow, bizarre procession, was a group of about 40 white men. The Inuit called them the Kalunat. But these men were not acting like normal human beings. They were lumbering across the ice with strange, jerky, uncoordinated movements, almost like their limbs were not fully under their control. Their skin was a sickly shade of blue and black, covered in frostbite and sores. Their clothes were tattered and frozen stiff, and their eyes were completely vacant, staring straight ahead as if they were dead on their feet. Now, the Inuit hunters knew that there was a group of white men living on a massive wooden ship that had become frozen in the ice off the coast of the island about a year prior. They had kept their distance, as there was always tension between the indigenous people and the white explorers. But they couldn't understand why these men had left their warm ship to walk across the freezing, barren land. And the way they were moving was deeply unsettling. It looked like some kind of disease or curse had taken hold of them. As the hunters watched, they noticed that several of the men were dragging a massive wooden sled behind them. The sled was piled high with something large, but it was completely covered by a thick, heavy canvas tarp. Suddenly, one of the men in the middle of the line let out an awful, guttural scream of pure agony. He began to wring his hands and thrash around, completely out of his mind. He collapsed onto the frozen ground, shivering and convulsing, but the other white men didn't even stop. They didn't look back. They just kept lumbering forward with their vacant stares. Only the men pulling the sled stopped. They pulled the heavy sled right up next to the dying man. They nonchalantly pulled back the frozen canvas tarp, and the Inuit hunters gasped in horror. Underneath the tarp was a massive pile of frozen human corpses. The men picked up the shivering, screaming man who had just collapsed, threw his body onto the pile of dead companions, and covered them back up with the canvas. Then they picked up the ropes and continued dragging the sled along the coast as if absolutely nothing had happened. The Inuit hunters were so terrified by this macabre display that they immediately backed down the hill and ran back to their village as fast as they could. The next day, the village elders held a meeting. They discussed what the hunters had seen. Even though the white men were strangers, the elders realized that these men must be starving and dying of exposure. They decided that the right thing to do was to offer them help. They wanted to show goodwill and establish peace. So, they instructed the hunters to return to the coast with several pounds of fresh seal meat to give to the starving men. The hunters returned to the ice hill, climbed to the top, and looked down. The coastline was completely empty. They walked down to the ice and found the deep tracks left by the heavy sled and the footprints of the 40 men. They decided to follow the tracks, hoping to catch up with them. They walked for hours across the freezing ice, scanning the horizon, but they saw no sign of life. Eventually, they came upon a campsite. It was set up right near the water's edge, but it was completely abandoned. The white men had left behind a significant amount of their gear. There were tents, tools, and the remains of a cold fire. This was incredibly strange. If you are struggling to survive in the Arctic, you do not abandon your tents and valuable cooking tools. The hunters searched the campsite, looking for any clue as to where the men had gone. One of the hunters walked over to the remains of the fire. Sitting on top of the cold coals was a large metal cooking pot with a heavy lid. Curious, the hunter reached down, grabbed the handle of the lid, and lifted it off. He took one look inside, dropped the lid, and backed away, vomiting into the snow. Inside the pot was a human skull. But it wasn't just a skull. The top of the skull had been violently cracked open, and the brain had been scooped out. The white men had resorted to cannibalism, and they were cooking and eating the remains of their own dead crew members. Terrified and disgusted, the hunters fled the campsite and returned to their village, deciding to leave the white men to their fate. Months later, the hunters decided to visit the massive wooden ship that was still frozen in the ice miles away. They knew by now that all the white men were dead, as they had found several mass graves along the coast. They figured that since the men were gone, they could salvage the supplies left on the ship. They walked across the frozen ocean and climbed on board the massive vessel. They expected to find a ruined, leaking, or damaged ship that had forced the men to flee, but to their absolute amazement, the ship was in pristine condition. It was clean, dry, and perfectly structurally sound. When they went down into the lower decks, they found beautiful cabins with comfortable beds, warm blankets, a library filled with books, fine china, and silver cutlery. And most shocking of all, they found a massive pantry packed to the brim with thousands of cans of preserved food. There was enough food on board to feed the entire crew for years. The hunters were completely baffled. Why would 40 men abandon a warm, safe ship filled with food to walk out into the freezing wilderness and eat each other to death? The answer to this mystery would not be discovered until the 1980s, when scientists exhumed the bodies of the crew members. It turned out that the crew was part of the famous, ill-fated Franklin expedition. When their ship became stuck in the ice, they were prepared to wait out the winter. But the cans of food they had brought with them had been sealed with lead solder. As they ate the food over the course of many months, the lead leached into their systems, slowly poisoning them. Lead poisoning causes extreme physical illness, but more importantly, it causes severe mental degradation and intense paranoia and hysteria. The entire crew had slowly gone completely insane. In their lead-induced madness, they became convinced that they had to abandon their perfectly safe ship. They loaded up a heavy sled with useless items like silver cutlery and heavy books, and dragged it out into the frozen wasteland where they slowly starved, went mad, and eventually turned on each other in a desperate, horrific attempt to survive. Now we move forward to the summer of 2018 to the state of Colorado. A 21-year-old rookie police officer named Derek was going through a very rough patch in his life. He had recently moved all the way to Colorado just to be closer to his longtime girlfriend. But shortly after he arrived, she unexpectedly broke up with him. Derek was completely devastated. He was alone in a brand new state, he didn't know many people, and he was spending all of his free time moping around his apartment, feeling incredibly depressed. After a few weeks of this, one of his close friends suggested that he try using Tinder, the online dating app. His friend told him that he needed to put himself out there and meet new people, and that Tinder was the easiest way to do it. Now, Derek had never used an online dating app before. He was a bit old-fashioned and had always met his previous girlfriends in person, usually at bars or through mutual friends. But he was incredibly lonely, so he decided he had nothing to lose. He downloaded the app, set up a profile, and started swiping. Very quickly, he matched with a woman named Leah. Leah was absolutely stunning. Derek honestly thought she was way out of his league, but he was thrilled that she had swiped right on him. They started texting, and they immediately hit it off. They had great chemistry, laughed at the same jokes, and eventually started talking on the phone for hours every night. After a couple of weeks, they decided it was time to meet in person. The only issue was that Leah lived about an hour and a half away from Derek, in a different town. They were trying to figure out a good place to meet, and Leah suggested that Derek should drive down to her town. She told him about this beautiful, secluded park that she went running in all the time. She said there was a massive grassy field on a slope surrounded by pine trees, and it was the perfect place to lay down, have some wine, and look up at the stars. Derek thought this sounded incredibly romantic and agreed. On the night of the date, Derek got dressed up, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. The plan was for him to drive to the hair salon where Leah worked and pick her up right when her shift ended. He made the long drive, pulled up to the salon, and saw Leah standing outside. She looked exactly like her pictures, and she was waving at him with a huge smile. She ran over, hopped into the passenger seat, and they hugged and kissed each other on the cheek. Derek felt an instant wave of relief. The connection they had online felt just as real in person. Leah gave him directions to the park, which was only a short drive away. But as they turned off the highway, Derek noticed that the road she was directing him onto was a narrow, unmarked dirt access road. It didn't look like the entrance to a public park at all. It looked like a fire road that led deep into the dark woods. As they drove further down the dirt road, the trees closed in around them, and it became pitch black. Derek, being a police officer, felt a tiny ping of suspicion. His training told him that this was a very isolated and potentially dangerous area. But he told himself he was just being paranoid. He was on a date with a beautiful girl, and she knew the area better than he did. Eventually, the dirt road turned back into pavement, and they pulled up next to a massive open grassy field. Derek felt his tension ease. It was exactly as she had described. He asked Leah where he should park, as there was no actual parking lot in sight. She pointed up the road and said there was a small pull-off area just ahead. Derek put the car in drive and started moving slowly up the road. But as he did, he saw two dim headlights appearing over the crest of the hill in front of them. A vehicle was coming down the narrow road directly toward them. Because the road was so narrow, Derek decided to pull his car over to the shoulder as far as possible to let the oncoming vehicle pass. But as the vehicle got closer, it didn't pass. It was a large, dark, unmarked utility van. The van slowed down, and at the very last second, it veered to the left and stopped directly in front of Derek's car, bumper to bumper, completely blocking him in. Derek's police instincts instantly kicked in. This was a classic tactical blocking maneuver. He felt a sudden rush of adrenaline. He reached into the center console, grabbed his heavy-duty police flashlight, and turned to Leah. He told her to stay in the car and lock the doors. He opened his door, stepped out into the cold night air, and aggressively marched up to the driver's side window of the van. He shined his bright flashlight directly into the driver's face. Inside the van was a large, burly man who looked incredibly startled to see a young, aggressive man staring back at him. Derek demanded to know what he was doing and why he had blocked him in. The man stammered, raised his hands defensively, and apologized. He claimed that he was the caretaker of the property and that they had been having a massive issue with illegal deer poachers in the area. He said he saw Derek's car and thought they might be poachers, but now he could see they were just a young couple. He told Derek to go ahead, enjoy his night, and said he was sorry for the trouble. The man put the van in reverse, backed up, did a three-point turn, and drove back over the hill, disappearing into the dark. Derek stood in the road for a minute, watching the taillights fade. He walked back to his car, hopped in, and tried to laugh it off. He joked to Leah that the guy must have thought she looked like a poacher, but when he looked over at her, she wasn't laughing. In fact, she wasn't even looking at him. She was hunched over her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen as she furiously texted someone. Derek thought this was a bit rude and unusual, given that they had just had a highly intense encounter. You would think she would be asking him if he was okay or what the caretaker had said. But he brushed it off, figured she was just texting a friend to tell them about the weird encounter, and drove up to the grassy field. They parked in a small dirt lot, got out of the car, and walked onto the hill. They spread out a blanket, opened a bottle of wine, and set up some food. Within a few minutes, the awkwardness faded. They were laughing, talking about their lives, and looking up at the beautiful, clear, starry sky. About an hour passed, and Derek was lying on his back, feeling completely relaxed, but then he saw a flash of light over the crest of the hill where the van had disappeared earlier. Suddenly, a vehicle came flying over the ridge. It was the same dark utility van, but this time, it was moving at an incredibly high speed. It roared down the road, turned sharply into the dirt lot, and slammed on its brakes, parking directly behind Derek's car, completely trapping it. Derek and Leah jumped up from the blanket. The driver's side door of the van flew open, and the caretaker hopped out. But he didn't look friendly anymore. He was holding a thick, heavy metal pipe in his hand, and he was marching directly toward Derek with a cold, dead expression. He pointed the pipe at Derek and demanded that he hand over his car keys and his wallet. Derek, being a trained police officer, did not panic. He stood his ground, sizing the man up, trying to figure out his next move. He wasn't going to just give up without a fight, but then he was hit with a massive shock. Leah, his beautiful date, suddenly ran past him. But she didn't run away. She ran straight to the caretaker, stood right next to him, turned around to face Derek, and sneered. She told Derek to give them his keys and his wallet and to stop making this difficult. Derek stood there in absolute disbelief. He realized in a fraction of a second that this entire date, the weeks of texting, the romantic stargazing, had all been a giant, elaborate setup. He had been lured into the middle of nowhere to be robbed, or worse. Leah walked to the back of the van, opened the doors, grabbed another metal pipe, and walked back over to the caretaker. She raised the pipe and told Derek that they didn't want to have to hurt him, but they would if he didn't cooperate. Derek looked at both of them, took a deep breath, and said no. The moment the word left his mouth, the large caretaker lunged forward and tackled Derek to the ground. But Derek was young, athletic, and highly trained in hand-to-hand combat. He managed to twist his body, throw the man off him, and scramble to his feet. As he stood up, he reached into his waistband and drew his personal concealed carry pistol. He pointed the gun directly at the caretaker's chest and then quickly aimed it at Leah. He screamed at them to freeze, drop the pipes, and put their hands in the air. He yelled that he was a police officer. The moment they saw the black steel of the handgun, their tough demeanor completely vanished. They dropped the metal pipes onto the gravel and raised their hands, trembling. Derek was holding them both at gunpoint, his heart hammering in his chest. He reached into his pocket with his left hand, pulled out his phone, and dialed 911. He got through to dispatch, gave them his name, his badge number, and explained that he had two suspects held at gunpoint in the park. But because the park was so isolated, he had a very difficult time explaining exactly where they were. As he was distracted, trying to give directions to the dispatcher, Leah and the caretaker made eye contact. They realized his attention was split. Suddenly, they both turned around and sprinted into the dark forest behind the van. Instinctively, Derek took off after them, still holding his phone to his ear. He chased them into the thick tree line, but after about 30 seconds of running in the pitch black, he heard a loud bang. A muzzle flash illuminated the trees ahead. Someone in the woods was shooting at him. Derek immediately stopped, realized he was completely outgunned and had no cover, and made the tactical decision to retreat. He ran back to his car, jumped inside, and started the engine. Because the van was blocking him, he had to slam his car into reverse, smash into the park fence, put it in drive, smash into the van, and perform a frantic turn until he finally managed to squeeze past the van and speed out of the park. He drove to the nearest well-lit gas station, called dispatch, and gave them his location. Within minutes, two senior officers he knew arrived at the scene. They listened to his story, and even though they gave him a little bit of a hard time for getting set up on a Tinder date, they knew how incredibly serious the situation was. They loaded Derek into their patrol car and drove back up to the park to investigate. When they arrived, the dark utility van was still parked in the dirt lot, its doors wide open. The two senior officers drew their weapons, cleared the area, and went inside the van to search it. When they came back out, all the humor was gone from their faces. They looked at Derek with dead serious expressions. They told him that the back of the van was loaded with a horrific toolkit. There were hunting knives, hacksaws, bone saws, handguns, rifles, cans of lighter fluid, heavy metal chains, handcuffs, rolls of duct tape, and what appeared to be dried bloodstains on the floorboards. This wasn't a robbery. Leah and the caretaker were serial predators, and Derek had been lured there to be tortured and murdered. The police launched a massive investigation. They went to the hair salon where Derek had picked Leah up. The management told them that no one named Leah had ever worked there, and when they showed the staff her picture, nobody recognized her. It turned out she had simply stood outside the building at closing time to make it look like she worked there. The phone number she had used was a burner, and her Tinder profile was completely fake. Despite a massive manhunt, Leah and the caretaker were never found. They vanished into the wind, leaving Derek with the chilling realization of just how close he had come to becoming a permanent victim in the back of that dark utility van. And finally, we go to the winter of 2004 to the rural town of Live Oak, Florida. A 16-year-old high school student named Misty Tasker was having a normal Saturday. That evening, she and her mother attended a service at their local church. After the service ended, they walked out to her mother's pickup truck to make the drive back to their country home. Their house was located about 20 minutes away, down a desolate, unlit country highway. Even though it was technically a highway, it was actually just a wide dirt road surrounded on both sides by incredibly thick, dark pine forests. There were no houses, no streetlights, and no businesses along this stretch of road. It was complete wilderness. Now, Misty's mother was an incredibly anxious driver under the best of conditions. She would sit hunched over the steering wheel, gripping it with both hands, staring intensely at the road. But driving at night was her absolute worst nightmare because she had terrible night vision. She avoided it at all costs, but because the church service had run late, she had no choice. The sun was setting fast, and she was driving as fast as she safely could on the dirt road, going about 55 miles per hour, desperate to get home before it became pitch black. Misty was sitting in the passenger seat looking out the window. Suddenly, as they flew down the empty road, Misty's eyes caught something on the shoulder. She turned her head and saw a small figure sitting in the dirt right at the edge of the forest. It looked like a little girl. Misty turned to her mother and said she thought she just saw a little girl sitting on the side of the road. Her mother, completely focused on the road, didn't hear her. Misty repeated herself, louder this time. She said they needed to turn around because a little girl had no business being out in the middle of nowhere in the dark. Misty's mother was highly annoyed. Turning around meant driving in the dark for even longer, which she hated. She asked Misty if she was absolutely sure she saw someone. Misty insisted that she did. Reluctantly, her mother slammed on the brakes, did a careful three-point turn on the narrow dirt road, and began driving back in the direction they had just come. They drove back about half a mile, slow rolling down the shoulder, scanning the dark forest. The sun had now completely set, and the only light came from the truck's headlights. Suddenly, they both spotted the figure. But as they got closer, they realized it wasn't a little girl. It was a young teenager. She was sitting in the dirt with her back to the road. Her knees were pulled tightly up to her chest, and she was slowly rocking back and forth. Now, Misty's mother felt a deep sense of unease. There were no houses for miles, no trails, and no broken-down cars. It made absolutely no sense for this girl to be sitting here, She decided that instead of stopping right next to her, she would drive past her first to get a better look, and then turn around and pull up. As they crept past the girl in the truck, they expected her to turn her head. A loud truck creeping past you on an empty dirt road in the middle of the night would naturally cause anyone to look. But the girl didn't move. She didn't acknowledge them at all. She just kept her back to them, rocking back and forth. Meisty's mother drove past her about 50 yards, did another three-point turn, and headed back. But when they shined their headlights on the spot where the girl had just been sitting, she was gone. The dirt shoulder was completely empty. They slowly drove up and down the stretch of road, shining their high beams into the thick pine trees. But there was no sign of her. Meisty's mother assumed she must have just walked back into the woods to wherever she lived and decided it was time to go home. She put her foot on the gas and accelerated. They drove for another 3 miles down the dark highway, the tension in the truck slowly fading. They were approaching a lonely four-way intersection with stop signs. As they slowed down to stop, the truck's headlights swept across the right-hand corner of the intersection. And Misty's mother let out a sharp gasp, slamming her foot on the brake. There, sitting in the dirt on the corner of the intersection, was the exact same girl. She had her back to the road, her knees pulled to her chest, and she was slowly rocking back and forth. Meisty and her mother sat in the idling truck, completely frozen in terror. They had just left this girl 3 miles back. It was physically impossible for a human being to run through a thick, tangled forest in the pitch black and beat a speeding truck to this intersection. Meisty felt a wave of absolute, primal dread wash over her. She looked at her mother and begged her not to stop. She screamed at her to just step on the gas and get them out of there, but her mother was torn. She was deeply terrified, but she was also a mother, and the thought of leaving a young teenage girl alone in the freezing dark on the side of a highway felt wrong. She told Misty that they had to at least ask if she was okay. Misty was sobbing now. She was so terrified that she took off her seatbelt, slid down into the passenger side footwell, curled into the fetal position, and covered her ears. She kept crying, begging her mother to just drive home. But her mother ignored her. She slowly rolled the truck forward until she was parked directly next to the rocking girl. She reached across the passenger seat, right over Misty, who was sobbing in the footwell, and manually rolled down the passenger window. The cold night air rushed into the cabin. Meisty's mother leaned toward the open window and called out to the girl, asking if she was okay and if she needed a ride. Misty, lying in the footwell, looked up at her mother's face. Suddenly, she saw her mother's eyes go wide with a horror that she had never seen before. Her mother let out a blood-curdling scream, threw the truck into drive, and slammed her foot on the gas pedal. The truck roared, tires spinning in the dirt, and they flew down the highway. Misty scrambled back up onto the seat, screaming, asking her mother what she had seen. Her mother was shaking violently, crying, clutching the steering wheel with a white-knuckled grip. She had her hand over her mouth, and she was barely able to speak. Finally, she gasped out that when she called to the girl had slowly turned her head to look at her. But she didn't have a face. Where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was nothing. It was just a hollow, dark, featureless void. Meisty and her mother screamed all the way back to their house. They ran inside, locked every door and window, and called the police. They didn't want to tell the dispatcher that they had seen a faceless demon, so they just said they saw a young girl who looked lost and injured. The police searched the intersection and the surrounding highway for hours, but they found absolutely nothing. No footprints, no girl, nothing. Meisty and her mother never spoke about that night again, but the image of that faceless girl rocking in the dirt would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.